Is the Sabbath law still binding? One of the most debated questions among religious groups today is whether the Sabbath law, given to Israel under the Old Testament, is still binding on Christians. Seventh-day Adventists in particular are known for teaching that Saturday is still God's holy day and must be observed. They point to passages like Exodus chapter 20 verses 8 through 11, where the command to keep the Sabbath was first given at Sinai, and argue that the law remains in force. Some even try to connect Hebrews chapter 4 verse 9, "There remains therefore a rest for the people of God," to the idea of Sabbath keeping. For example, writers have claimed that Sabbath observance is not only about physical rest, but also about spiritual rest from sin, and that Hebrews 4 verse 9 confirms this. But is that what the passage is really saying? I believe this is a serious misunderstanding of Hebrews. To see why, let's go back to the Old Testament background that the Hebrew writer himself points to. In Deuteronomy chapter 12 verses 9 and 10, Moses told the Israelites, "For you have not yet come to the rest and the inheritance which the Lord your God is giving you. But when you cross over the Jordan and dwell in the land which the Lord your God is giving you to inherit, and he gives you rest from all your enemies round about, so that you dwell in safety." Notice here that rest was connected to entering the promised land and enjoying peace from their enemies. It was not about keeping a weekly Sabbath day, it was about inheritance and security in the land. But something went wrong. The generation that came out of Egypt failed to enter that promised rest because of unbelief. Psalm 95 records God's warning, "They shall not enter my rest." The writer of Hebrews quotes this in chapters 3 and 4 to remind Christians that unbelief can still keep people from the true rest God has promised. So, what is the rest in Hebrews chapter 4 verse 9? Is it the Sabbath day or, something else? Let's consider a few reasons why it really cannot be the Sabbath law. First, Hebrews makes a distinction between the shadow and the reality. The rest described in Hebrews chapter 3 verses 11 and 18, the rest that Israel failed to enter, was actually a shadow of something greater. Hebrews chapter 10 verse 1 explains that the old law contained a shadow of good things to come, not the very image of the things. If the shadow was not about the Sabbath, then honestly, the reality in Christ cannot be about the Sabbath either. Second, the shadow rest of Deuteronomy chapter 12 referred to the inheritance in Canaan. The fulfillment, then, must also be tied to inheritance, but a far greater one. Christians are promised an eternal inheritance. Acts chapter 20 verse 32, Ephesians chapter 1 verse 11, Colossians chapter 1 verse 12, and 1 Peter chapter 1 verses 3 to 5 all speak of it. Third, Hebrews chapter 4 verse 3 says, "We who have believed do enter that rest." This shows that the rest is something tied to faith in Christ, not simply to a day of the week. Israel's rest was freedom from enemies in the land. Our rest is far deeper. It mirrors God's own rest when he ceased from his works at creation, as we see in Genesis chapter 2, verse 2, and Hebrews chapter 4, verses 4 to 5. And then, Revelation chapter 14, verse 13, tells us what it means for Christians. "Blessed are the dead who die in the Lord. They may rest from their labors, and their works follow them." Finally, the word used in Hebrews chapter 4, verse 9 is unique. The Greek word is sabbatismos, which means a Sabbath rest or a Sabbath keeping. But it does not mean the observance of a literal Saturday Sabbath. Instead, it describes the type of rest that God's people will enjoy, the ultimate eternal rest with him. It points forward to the heavenly inheritance, not backward to the law of Moses. So what can we conclude? Hebrews chapter 4 verse 9 is not telling Christians to keep the Sabbath day. Rather, it points to the greater rest God has promised his people through Christ. Israel's Sabbath was a shadow. The true Sabbath rest, the eternal rest, belongs to those who remain faithful to Jesus. The weekly Sabbath law was part of the Old Covenant, and it ended at the cross, as we read in Colossians chapter 2, verses 14 to 17. Christians now look forward, not to a day, but to an eternal inheritance and rest with God.